The restaurant
We'll
was
have the
unlike
steak.
any other in
How would you
Berlin.
like that cooked?
Its high
Medium rare,
ceilings
please.
reflected the
Perfect, I'll
soft
get that
golden
in.
light of crystal chandeliers, casting a warm glow on polished marble floors. Every table was set with the finest white linens, sparkling glassware, and silver cutlery that shone as though it had never been touched before. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfumes, fresh bread, and a hint of roasted coffee, blending together to create an atmosphere that was both luxurious and intimidating. Patrons whispered quietly at their tables, dressed in designer suits and gowns, their laughter restrained, careful not to break the delicate air of elegance that the restaurant demanded. The walls were lined with exquisite artwork, paintings that captured distant landscapes and abstract pieces that made the room feel modern yet timeless. It was a place where wealth and power were displayed as effortlessly as the waiters moved between tables, bringing champagne and delicacies to those seated. Amid all this luxury, a young waitress moved gracefully from table to table, balancing trays with an ease that only came from years of practice. She was tall, poised, and wore the standard black uniform, crisp and perfectly fitted. Her hair was neatly tied back, and her eyes sparkled with quiet intelligence. She knew her place in this world, yet there was something about the way she carried herself that set her apart. While many of the guests barely noticed her, some caught glimpses of her calm confidence, the way she smiled politely even when customers were rude, and the way she seemed completely unfazed by the grandeur surrounding her. She had seen wealth and arrogance before, but she had learned early on that dignity and composure could speak louder than money or status. At that very moment, a limousine arrived outside the restaurant, and the driver stepped out, holding the door for a man who exuded power and confidence in every step. The billionaire was known in elite circles as a man who could command attention without raising his voice, a man whose wealth had made him untouchable. His presence always caused a subtle shift in the room, servers straightened, patrons whispered, and even the music seemed to soften in deference. He entered the restaurant, dressed in a tailored suit that fit perfectly, the kind of suit that made it clear he was used to getting exactly what he wanted. His eyes scanned the room quickly, calculating, observing, and judging. The waitress noticed him immediately, not out of fear, but because there was something in his demeanor that was impossible to ignore. She had seen powerful people before, but there was a cold arrogance in him, a kind of confidence that crossed into cruelty if provoked. She continued her work, moving from table to table, her steps silent on the marble floor, but she couldn't help feeling the tension in the air as the billionaire approached the main dining area. The staff whispered quietly among themselves, a mixture of admiration and anxiety in their voices. He was someone who could make or break reputations with a single word, and everyone knew it. Despite the atmosphere of elegance, there was a subtle tension, almost like the calm before a storm. Patrons sipped their wine nervously, glancing at the billionaire as if expecting something dramatic to happen. The clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of conversations, and the gentle notes of a pianist playing in the corner all seemed to pause, suspended in anticipation. The waitress, however, remained steady. She had learned long ago that the rich and powerful often tried to intimidate those around them, but intimidation rarely worked on someone who knew their own worth. She moved to refill a customer's glass, her hand steady, her smile polite, never letting the looming presence of wealth shake her composure. The restaurant, grand as it was, felt smaller with him in the room. Every waiter, every customer, every staff member seemed to shrink slightly under his gaze. And yet, the young waitress carried herself with a quiet strength. She knew that appearances could be deceiving, and that often, intelligence and skill mattered more than status or money. Little did anyone know that her calm, collected demeanor would soon be put to the ultimate test, and what began as a normal evening in a high-end restaurant would turn into a story that no one there would ever forget. The billionaire had barely settled into his seat when he noticed her, the young waitress moving elegantly between tables, her black uniform crisp, her hair tied neatly, her calm smile almost daring him to underestimate her. Most people in the restaurant paid her no mind, but to him, she was just another object to test, another person whose dignity he could toy with for amusement. He leaned back slightly in his chair, scanning the room with sharp, calculating eyes, and a sly smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He was used to control, used to bending situations to his will, and he believed that a simple display of authority could make anyone falter. Tonight, he decided, he would amuse himself with the challenge of humiliation, just to remind the room, and perhaps himself, of who held power. He spoke in German, his words smooth and commanding. "Laugh at her," he said, gesturing toward the waitress with a subtle flick of his hand. His tone carried the weight of absolute certainty, the kind that came from knowing he had never been wrong, that people bent to him without question. Around him, his entourage stifled smiles, eager to participate in what they expected to be a moment of entertainment, a minor act of dominance in their privileged world. The atmosphere changed instantly, whispers flowed like a gentle current through the room, the staff exchanging uneasy glances. The billionaire's command wasn't just a joke, it was a test of obedience and, in his mind, superiority. The waitress paused mid-step, her tray of champagne flutes suspended lightly in her hands. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, calm, steady, and unflinching. The faintest curve of her lips hinted at amusement, not fear. She had faced people like him before, arrogant, powerful individuals who believed money and status could intimidate. But she knew that confidence was not bought, it was earned through knowledge, skill, and self-respect. And though the room seemed to shrink around his commanding presence, she refused to give in to the tension he tried to create. Her composure radiated like a quiet light, unshaken, unbroken, and utterly mesmerizing to anyone watching. The billionaire's companions leaned closer, expecting her to falter. A slight tremor in her hands, a forced smile, even a hint of nervous laughter, any of these would be enough to validate his authority and provoke their amusement. But none appeared. She placed the tray down with precise, deliberate movements, as if time had slowed around her, and then she spoke. The words were measured, her voice steady, and the accent, a soft but unmistakable lilt, carried confidence and intelligence. At that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Patrons who had been quietly sipping wine paused mid-bite, servers froze mid-step, and even the soft music of the pianist faded into silence, as if sensing the drama unfolding. The billionaire, accustomed to control, felt an unusual prickling in his chest, curiosity mixed with a rare, uncomfortable uncertainty. He had never encountered someone so unshakable, someone who didn't bend under the weight of wealth and intimidation. Her response was not confrontational, it was subtle, strategic, a quiet assertion of presence. Without a trace of panic, she let the eyes of the room linger on her confidence, her skill, and the faint intelligence that gleamed behind them. She knew that humiliation could only succeed if fear existed, and she had none. The billionaire's smirk faltered slightly, replaced by the tiniest flash of surprise. He had expected weakness, he had expected submission. Instead, he found poise, elegance, and an unspoken challenge. What happened next was almost imperceptible but entirely transformative. The energy in the room shifted. The diners who had come expecting a moment of arrogance and ridicule now watched something entirely different, a quiet standoff between power and intelligence, wealth and dignity, arrogance and self-respect. The waitress had turned a simple command into a suspenseful encounter, a demonstration that control could not simply be demanded, it could be resisted with the right blend of calm, awareness, and confidence. Even as the billionaire attempted to mask his astonishment, the room's subtle whispers began to acknowledge the change. Respect was forming, quietly, like a wave beneath the surface, and the waitress remained at the center of it, unyielding, composed, and entirely unshaken. In that moment, it became clear, this would not be an ordinary evening. What had begun as a test of obedience and humiliation was evolving into something far more memorable, a confrontation that would leave everyone in the room reconsidering assumptions, power, and the real meaning of respect. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath as the billionaire leaned back in his chair, expecting a reaction. He had commanded ridicule, certain that the young waitress would shrink under his gaze, perhaps stammer, or worse, attempt to appease him with a nervous laugh. But she did none of those things. Instead, she paused, placing her tray carefully on a nearby table, and for a moment, simply looked at him. Her eyes were steady, unflinching, intelligent, and in them lay a quiet power he had never encountered before. The slight curve of her lips suggested she knew something he did not, and the billionaire, for the first time in many years, felt a flicker of uncertainty. The room around them seemed to shrink. Patrons who had come to enjoy their meal suddenly became spectators, glancing at each other with wide eyes, whispers barely contained. Even the staff, trained to remain invisible unless called upon, stopped moving, holding their breath in anticipation. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough that the gentle music from the piano seemed to falter. Everyone could sense that something remarkable was about to happen, though no one yet knew what. Then she spoke. Not timidly, not hesitantly, but clearly, precisely, her voice carrying calm authority. First, she responded in French, smoothly translating the billionaire's sarcastic remark and turning it into a polite, witty observation that left a few patrons nodding quietly in appreciation. His companions blinked, shocked, as if they had just seen an illusion. Then she switched effortlessly to Spanish, maintaining the same elegance and composure, her words so natural that it was impossible to detect hesitation. The billionaire's smirk wavered. This was not what he had expected. She continued. Italian, Japanese, Arabic, Russian, and finally, English. Each language rolled from her lips with clarity and charm, her confidence never faltering. Patrons leaned forward in their chairs, listening intently, drawn into a story they had not expected to hear. The billionaire, usually so certain of his place and power, felt the ground shift beneath him. He had underestimated her, judging her by her uniform, her age, her position in the restaurant, but she had turned the entire dynamic upside down in a matter of moments. The young waitress had become the center of the room, her linguistic skill a revelation that none could ignore. It was more than just speaking different languages. It was the poise, the intelligence, the way she carried herself while effortlessly demonstrating mastery of each tongue. The whispers of admiration grew louder, blending with shocked laughter and quiet murmurs of awe. Even the billionaire's entourage found themselves distracted, unable to look away from her brilliance. He realized, reluctantly, that he was no longer in control of the scene. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate had become a lesson in humility. The waitress, without confrontation or anger, had proven that intelligence and skill could challenge arrogance. Her calm, dignified presence showed the room that power was not always measured in wealth, status, or commands. True influence could be subtle, quiet, and utterly persuasive. The billionaire tried to recover his composure, leaning forward slightly, but the effect had already taken hold. Patrons who had once expected a simple scene of ridicule were now witnessing a demonstration of wit, courage, and mastery. He realized that her ability to communicate in multiple languages was not just talent, it was a symbol of education, culture, and self-assurance, qualities he could not buy or command. Even in the face of someone he had tried to belittle, the waitress never lost her cool. Each word she spoke, each language she shifted into, reminded everyone present that assumptions were dangerous and that appearances could be deceiving. Her brilliance created a quiet revolution in the room, arrogance had met intelligence, and for the first time, the billionaire encountered someone who refused to bow, someone who demanded respect without demanding attention. By the time she finished, the room was alive with murmurs of admiration, and the billionaire, for the first time, felt the sting of being wrong. He had come to command and control, to amuse himself with someone he assumed was beneath him. Instead, he had encountered brilliance, courage, and skill, all wrapped in the calm confidence of a woman who refused to be underestimated. In that moment, it became clear, this was not just a waitress, this was a force to be reckoned with, and no command, no wealth, no arrogance could change that. The room felt electric, charged with an energy no one could ignore. The billionaire, accustomed to controlling the flow of attention wherever he went, now realized that the spotlight had shifted entirely. All eyes were on the young waitress, whose calm, confident presence had transformed what should have been a scene of ridicule into a display of awe. Patrons whispered among themselves, servers paused mid-step, and even the pianist's soft notes seemed to hesitate, waiting to see what would happen next. The billionaire tried to regain control, leaning forward with a measured smirk, hoping to intimidate her into submission. Impressive, he said in German, his voice low but commanding, but can someone really be that clever? It was meant as sarcasm, a way to regain dominance, but the room caught the challenge in his tone. The waitress did not flinch. Instead, she smiled, faint but knowing, and replied in perfect German, her words polite yet razor-sharp, translating his sarcasm back to him in a way that highlighted his arrogance without confrontation. A few of his companions stifled shocked laughs, realizing that what they had thought would be a simple act of humiliation had become an intricate display of intelligence and composure. The waitress had not just spoken multiple languages, she had spoken directly to the billionaire's ego, using wit and precision, and in doing so, had subtly turned the tables. Her calm confidence made it clear that she saw through his act, and she would not allow him to dominate the situation. She continued to engage him, switching effortlessly between languages as she addressed him and his entourage. Each time she spoke, she included subtle observations, clever remarks that exposed the ridiculousness of his arrogance. The patrons leaned in, listening carefully, sensing the quiet power play unfolding before them. It was like watching a master class in social strategy, humility meeting arrogance, wit meeting wealth, and intelligence meeting entitlement. The billionaire's smirk faded. He had expected fear, nervousness, maybe even embarrassment. Instead, he found dignity and brilliance that could not be intimidated. He tried to mask his shock with a laugh, but even that sounded hollow in the charged silence of the room. The waitress's words were precise, chosen carefully, each one demonstrating not only her skill but also her awareness of the subtle power dynamics at play. She was proving a point without raising her voice or breaking etiquette. Intelligence cannot be commanded, and respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. For the first time in years, the billionaire felt an unfamiliar tug of uncertainty. His presence, his wealth, his reputation, none of it gave him leverage here. The young waitress had something far more powerful, confidence grounded in skill, intelligence, and self-respect. He realized that every command, every attempt at intimidation, had been met with composure that neither flinched nor faltered. She had taken what was meant to be a display of dominance and transformed it into a showcase of dignity and power. The room responded quietly but unmistakably. Patrons who had been anticipating a brief spectacle of arrogance now whispered among themselves in admiration. Even the staff, trained to follow orders, watched in awe as she maintained control of a situation designed to make her small. In that moment, the billionaire understood something crucial: wealth and status could bend many, but they could not bend everyone. And the young waitress, with her effortless skill and quiet confidence, was proof of that truth. She continued her service, moving among tables with the same grace and poise she had from the beginning, never allowing her focus to waver. Each step, each glance, each perfectly timed word reinforced her control over the room. The billionaire, who had once thought of her as insignificant, could only watch, slowly realizing that true power was not in money or commands, but in composure, skill, and the ability to command respect through presence rather than intimidation. By the time she returned to the main area, the energy had shifted completely. The restaurant's patrons now regarded her with admiration, the staff with respect, and the billionaire with something approaching reluctant acknowledgement. In a single, quiet, confident display, she had turned a moment designed to humiliate into one that elevated her entirely above the billionaire's arrogance. What had begun as a test of obedience had become a demonstration of intelligence, strategy, and the undeniable strength of dignity, and the room, like a tide, had turned in her favor. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted so dramatically that it was almost tangible. Patrons who had been quietly enjoying their meals now found themselves leaning forward, captivated by the scene unfolding before them. The young waitress moved gracefully, her tray balanced perfectly in her hands, yet every step she took radiated authority. She no longer seemed just like a server in a black uniform, she was a force, commanding attention through poise, intelligence, and quiet confidence. The billionaire, who had entered the restaurant expecting amusement, now felt a sense of unease he had rarely experienced. He tried to regain control, speaking in German again, this time attempting a firmer tone. "You are clever, yes, but cleverness does not replace obedience," he said, his voice calm but edged with challenge. The room tensed, waiting for the expected conflict, but the waitress responded with the same composure she had shown all along. She did not shout, she did not defy rudely, she simply looked at him with a steady, almost serene gaze, and replied in German, her words both polite and pointed. Every syllable reminded him that she was not afraid, that his status and wealth could not dictate her behavior, and that his attempt to intimidate had failed. Her confidence grew with each passing moment, and it became clear to everyone present that the billionaire was no longer the center of attention. The whispers around the room were not of mockery, as he had hoped, but of admiration. Guests began exchanging glances, impressed by her intelligence, charm, and unshakable poise. Even the staff, who had initially been tense with fear of upsetting him, felt a subtle shift in power. Respect, not fear, was now the currency in the room, and the waitress had it in abundance. She moved toward another table, attending to a customer with perfect courtesy, but each word she spoke subtly carried her message. Her multilingual skills were not just a display, they were a demonstration of capability, intelligence, and self-assurance. Patrons whispered in awe, some secretly wishing they could possess even a fraction of her knowledge and composure. The billionaire, however, remained frozen in his seat, realizing that the woman he had underestimated had entirely rewritten the rules of engagement. His usual confidence had been replaced by a slow, uncomfortable realization. He had been defeated without a single raised voice or aggressive action. Then came the final display that cemented her dominance in the room. A guest at another table attempted a small joke at her expense, perhaps testing her in turn. Without hesitation, she responded in fluent English, her tone polite but impossibly sharp, turning the joke into a clever compliment about the guest's curiosity. Laughter erupted around the table, not mocking her, but admiring her wit. The restaurant, which had once been a place where arrogance was expected to rule, was now captivated by humility, skill, and intelligence. The billionaire's expression changed slowly, almost imperceptibly, from surprise to grudging respect. He realized that his attempt to demonstrate power had only highlighted his own arrogance. This young woman, who had appeared to be beneath him in every social and financial measure, now held the moral high ground. She had shown everyone in the room that true strength came not from wealth, position, or intimidation, but from composure, intelligence, and self-confidence. For the first time, the billionaire leaned back in his chair, silent, observing rather than commanding. The waitress continued her work, moving among tables, carrying herself with elegance, grace, and an unspoken authority. Patrons began applauding quietly, a few raising their glasses in acknowledgement of her skill. Even the staff shared subtle nods of admiration. This was no ordinary server, and her presence had transformed an ordinary evening into a lesson in dignity and respect. By the time she returned to the main area, the room had shifted entirely. The tension that had accompanied the billionaire's arrival had dissolved, replaced with admiration for a woman who refused to be intimidated. It was clear to everyone present that she had won, not by confrontation, not by raising her voice, but by being unflinchingly confident, skilled, and intelligent. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The billionaire had entered expecting to control, but he left realizing that respect cannot be commanded, it must be earned. And in that room, the young waitress had earned it in abundance. The billionaire sat frozen in his chair, the polished mahogany table before him suddenly feeling too small, too ordinary for the storm of realization brewing in his mind. He had walked into the restaurant expecting amusement, expecting compliance, expecting to bend someone to his will without effort. And yet, in a matter of moments, his carefully constructed world had tilted on its axis. The young waitress, calm, poised, and impossibly intelligent, had dismantled his assumptions without raising her voice, without overt confrontation, and without ever breaking the rules of decorum. He watched as she moved between tables, attending to customers with grace, her multilingual words flowing effortlessly, her smile polite but firm. Patrons leaned toward each other in quiet awe, whispering about her skill and presence. Some subtly raised their glasses to her, small gestures of respect that he could not ignore. The billionaire felt an unfamiliar weight pressing down on him, the weight of being wrong, the weight of having misjudged someone so thoroughly. For the first time in years, arrogance faltered, replaced by the sharp sting of humility. His mind raced. How had he, a man who commanded millions and controlled industries, been so completely outmaneuvered in a restaurant? He had expected nervous laughter, embarrassment, perhaps a stammer of apology, but none of that had come. Instead, he had witnessed intelligence, poise, and a quiet authority that dwarfed his own. Every move she made, every word she spoke, reinforced what he had failed to see. Power was not about wealth or commands, but about confidence, skill, and respect earned through action rather than force. The billionaire's companions exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the shift in energy. They had always relied on his dominance to dictate behavior, to set the tone of every room, yet here it was, crumbling quietly. His sharp eyes scanned the room, trying to understand what had happened, but the realization was inescapable. The waitress had taken control of the situation with subtlety, wit, and intelligence, and there was nothing he could do to reclaim it. He thought about the arrogance that had carried him through life, the belief that money and status could compel obedience. That belief had been shattered tonight, quietly but completely. The waitress had never raised her voice, had never demanded recognition, and yet she had claimed authority over the room in a way that he could neither challenge nor replicate. The billionaire felt the sting of vulnerability, a feeling foreign to a man accustomed to always winning. For once, he was powerless in the face of dignity, intellect, and self-assurance. As the waitress continued her work, she occasionally glanced in his direction, her expression calm but knowing. It was not a look of triumph, nor was it mocking. It was simply the quiet acknowledgement of a victory earned through skill, patience, and presence. Each glance reinforced his discomfort, a subtle reminder that wealth and status could not substitute for confidence and intelligence. The patrons, watching her with admiration, had begun to see the billionaire differently too, not as the untouchable force he projected, but as a man momentarily humbled by someone he underestimated. The sting of humility deepened as he reflected on his behavior. He had expected to assert dominance, to amuse himself at her expense, yet the real lesson came from being confronted with his own assumptions. He had been blind to the quiet power of skill, composure, and intelligence, the very qualities that the waitress displayed effortlessly. In that moment, he understood that respect was not something to be demanded, nor was superiority something to be assumed. It was earned, and she had earned it fully, gracefully, and undeniably. The billionaire leaned back, silent, allowing the realization to sink in. He could no longer see her as a mere server. She was something far greater, a force of intellect and poise, a living demonstration that true power often lay in subtlety and presence rather than wealth and intimidation. The room, which had once revolved around his presence, now felt centered on her. He had entered expecting dominance, but instead, he had encountered a lesson in humility, and it was one he could not ignore or dismiss. For the first time, he felt the sharp, quiet sting of being humbled, and in that feeling, he began to understand something profound. The world was not ruled by money alone, and arrogance could be outmatched by intelligence, composure, and courage. The waitress had proven it tonight, effortlessly, and he had no choice but to acknowledge it. The restaurant, once a stage for arrogance and control, had transformed into a quiet theater of admiration and respect. Patrons who had entered expecting to witness a simple display of power now found themselves captivated by the young waitress, whose poise and intelligence had turned the entire evening on its head. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke, carried weight and authority, and the subtle reverence from the diners was almost palpable. It was no longer about the billionaire's wealth or status, it was about respect earned through skill, composure, and courage. The billionaire remained seated, still observing her, a mixture of awe and reluctant admiration settling over him. He had come prepared to dominate, expecting to command laughter and subservience, but she had shifted the dynamic entirely. He watched as she moved gracefully to serve a table of guests, speaking effortlessly in French, translating their requests with precision and warmth. Even small interactions, the way she listened, smiled, and responded, demonstrated a mastery of social grace that few could rival. The billionaire realized that the true power she wielded was subtle, quiet, and far more compelling than wealth or intimidation. Finally, she approached his table. Patrons around them seemed to pause, sensing that a pivotal moment had arrived. She did not bow or lower her gaze, she stood tall, radiating confidence and dignity. Her calm, polite smile contrasted sharply with the tension he had once expected her to display. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, a silent exchange passing between them, one that carried acknowledgement, understanding, and mutual respect. "You handled this situation perfectly," he said slowly, his voice quieter than before, almost reflective. The words were not sarcastic, not commanding, they were genuine, tinged with humility. She tilted her head slightly, allowing a small smile, an acknowledgement of his recognition without diminishing her own presence. In that exchange, the balance of power had shifted completely. He had been humbled, not through conflict, but through her mastery of intelligence, composure, and grace. The staff, watching closely, began to relax, inspired by the subtle transformation in the billionaire's demeanor. Patrons whispered quietly, some nodding in appreciation, recognizing that they had just witnessed a rare moment, a confrontation where dignity and intellect had triumphed over arrogance, leaving even the most powerful man in the room to reflect on his assumptions. The waitress, once seen as a mere server, was now an example of how skill, poise, and intelligence could command respect in any setting. Even the billionaire's companions were affected. The smug expressions they had worn earlier had softened into looks of contemplation. It was clear to them now that respect could not be demanded, and authority could not simply be assumed. The young waitress had not only maintained her composure under pressure, but she had elevated the entire environment with her presence. The evening, which had begun as a simple test of obedience, had become a lesson in humility and grace for everyone in the room. The billionaire took a slow, deliberate breath. For the first time, he considered his own behavior, reflecting on the arrogance that had brought him here. He realized that power without respect was fragile, and authority without understanding was meaningless. She had shown him, quietly but undeniably, that true influence came from a combination of intelligence, confidence, and moral courage, qualities he could not buy, demand, or command. With a final, measured nod, he acknowledged her fully. "You've made a profound impression tonight," he said, voice steady now, no longer carrying the edge of superiority. She returned the nod, polite yet firm, signaling that the encounter had reached its natural conclusion. There was no triumph in mockery, no victory in humiliation, only mutual recognition and a quiet respect that transcended wealth and status. As she walked away, continuing her work with the same grace and poise she had displayed throughout the evening, the billionaire watched her, silently humbled. Patrons and staff alike carried the unspoken realization that they had witnessed something extraordinary, a demonstration of true power and respect, earned not through fear or wealth, but through intelligence, courage, and self-assurance. The evening had begun with arrogance and expectation, but it ended with admiration, reflection, and a lasting lesson. Dignity and skill are the greatest forms of authority, and respect is earned, not demanded. The restaurant had returned to its usual rhythm, yet the energy lingered like a gentle hum beneath the surface, impossible to ignore. Patrons resumed their meals, but their eyes occasionally flicked toward the young waitress, who moved with the same grace and confidence that had defined the entire evening. Every tray she carried, every word she spoke, now seemed infused with an unspoken power, a quiet authority that no wealth or status could challenge. What had begun as an ordinary night in an upscale Berlin restaurant had transformed into an unforgettable lesson in humility, intelligence, and respect. The billionaire sat in his chair, silent, watching her from across the room. For the first time, he understood the limits of his power, the fragility of authority that relies solely on money and influence. He had walked in expecting compliance, expecting amusement, expecting to assert dominance over someone he had underestimated. Instead, he had been confronted with something far more compelling: skill, confidence, and integrity that could not be bought or commanded. His ego, though bruised, was tempered by understanding. He realized that true respect could never be demanded, it had to be earned, and she had earned it in full. Around them, the patrons whispered in admiration. Some had witnessed similar displays of wealth and influence before, but few had seen the quiet yet undeniable power of composure and intelligence. The young waitress had become the center of attention, not by loud declarations, not by defiance, but by being herself, skilled, poised, multilingual, and unafraid. Every movement she made reinforced the lesson she had imparted without speaking a single word about it. Dignity, courage, and intellect were more powerful than arrogance or status. The staff exchanged subtle glances of awe and respect. They had served her for months, even years, yet tonight revealed dimensions of her they had never fully appreciated. She had not only managed the expectations of a powerful billionaire but had also shifted the perception of everyone in the room, turning an attempt at humiliation into a demonstration of mastery and grace. Her actions would ripple through the restaurant long after the night ended, a story whispered among patrons and employees alike, a legend of quiet triumph. Even the billionaire's entourage, initially smug and confident, had been transformed. They had entered expecting entertainment at another's expense and instead witnessed something far more profound, the triumph of intelligence, courage, and presence over arrogance. They would leave that evening with a new understanding of power, one rooted not in commands or wealth but in respect, skill, and poise. As the waitress moved through the restaurant one final time that evening, she paused briefly at the window, looking out at the city lights of Berlin. There was no arrogance in her stance, no trace of gloating, only quiet pride in a job done with excellence and integrity. She had faced an unexpected challenge, one that could have been intimidating or humiliating, and turned it into a demonstration of her true capabilities. Her story would not be told through wealth, power, or dominance, but through respect earned effortlessly, through intelligence applied skillfully, and through courage expressed calmly. The billionaire, finally rising from his chair, approached her. This time, there was no command in his tone, no expectation of submission. Instead, there was recognition, an acknowledgement of her strength and brilliance. "You've taught me something valuable tonight," he said, his voice measured and sincere, "something I will not forget." She nodded politely, accepting the respect without diminishing her own presence. It was a quiet, balanced moment, one of mutual acknowledgement, of lessons learned, and of dignity preserved. As he left the restaurant, the billionaire carried with him more than a simple evening out. He carried the memory of a lesson in humility, intelligence, and courage, a reminder that true power is often invisible yet unmistakable. Patrons would speak of the night for weeks, and the staff would retell the story to newcomers, the night when arrogance met brilliance, when a billionaire learned that status alone could not command respect, and when a young waitress, fluent in 7 languages, became the quiet hero of an unforgettable story. In that evening's unfolding, one truth had become clear: respect cannot be bought, power cannot be forced, and assumptions, no matter how confident, are always risky. The young waitress had proven that skill, courage, and composure could elevate anyone above even the most intimidating forces, leaving an enduring impression that would resonate far beyond the walls of the restaurant. And in that, her victory was complete, not in wealth, not in applause, but in the quiet certainty of having turned arrogance into humility, expectation into admiration, and challenge into triumph.